I'm Simon Rosenberg with NDN, and really grateful for all of you coming tonight. We are on an extended road show with Rob. This is our third city as part of the rollout of his new book, which for the camera and for all of you, Futurecast. I've actually read it. It's a great book. But we wanted to use tonight and the book that Rob has published to really share some thoughts from our angle at NDN. And Rob is the head of our Globalization initiative and been a co-author with me and been a collaborator with NDN for the last 3 years, really on what's happening with the American economy, is to really share some thoughts about what is happening with the American economy, what's happening with global politics, what's happening with global demography, because what Rob's book lays out really more than anything else is the world that we will be inhabiting after the very disappointing age of Bush, and the things that we need to understand in order to successfully lead America and govern this remarkable nation in a time where things are changing. And what I'm excited about this book, and I really strongly recommend it, is that it's a big swing. It's not just about economics. I mean, it really takes a look at where the world is headed in the next 15 to 20 years. And that's what we're going to hear about tonight from Rob. For those of you who don't know Rob, Rob has been the chair of NDN's Globalization Initiative. He also was the Undersecretary of Commerce in the second Clinton term for Economic Affairs. He was also the chief economic advisor to then Governor Bill Clinton in the 1992 campaign, which is where we met. And when James Carville said it's the economy, stupid, he often was talking about the work that Rob had done to lay out the economic argument for then Governor Bill Clinton. He also had worked in the Senate and is a PhD political economist from this institution from Harvard, right, appropriately, and has really been, I think, seen by many as one of the leading political economists and economic thinkers in politics for really almost a generation, and certainly on the left of center side has been one of the most influential, I think. And it's really great to have Rob here. And Rob, we're going to hear from you for about 15 minutes and then open it up, because I know people want to talk about what's going on in politics these days. So welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Simon. And thank you all for coming. You spent a couple of years writing a book and you throw it out there and you have no idea whether anyone will listen or read it. And so it's great to have a group of more than 2 or 3 of my friends in my living room listening to what I think is happening in the world. Everybody in every era thinks they live in an era of change, that there are unique things about their time, and there probably are unique things about any time. But in this particular period, we can identify 3 really singular shifts occurring, a really global scale, sufficiently deep and sufficiently broad to affect the paths of the world's major nations over the next 10 to 15 years. Beyond that, we really don't know what's going to happen. Technology changes, politics changes, changes accumulate. But these 3 phenomena are so large and so deep that we can trace with some real certainty some of their impacts. And I want to describe the 3 of them briefly, and then we can talk about any aspect of them that interests you. The first is demography, the aging of nations. There is not one instance in our historical records of a single society having an unusually large generation followed by an unusually small generation. Cases of unusually small generations usually because of plagues or wars, but never that particular combination in one instance. We're now seeing it on a global scale. It's happening in virtually every society outside of the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. And it has enormous economic and political implications. The economic implications arise significantly from the fact that, from 2 facts. One is that saving behavior is age-specific. People tend to save from their mid-30s to their mid-50s. Normally, this is not a problem because generations get bigger. But when you hit this kind of situation in which you have a generation that is contracting and that cohort contracts, it means the saving rate contracts. As the saving rate contracts, investment rates contract unless you're a society that can attract savings from everywhere else in the world. Japan is on the cutting edge of demographic change, that is the aging. And I remember when Japan was thought of as a high saving society, it was a high saving society. In the last 20 years, the saving rate of Japan has fallen from 25% to 5%. This is also beginning to occur across Europe. The other major economic effect is that economic growth is the sum of improvements in productivity and expansions in the labor force. And what we're beginning to see across Europe and in Japan, and they're again on the cutting edge, is contractions in the labor force. The Japanese labor force today is contracting at an average annual rate of 1% a year. The number of elderly people are increasing at a rate of 3% a year. The same thing will begin in France around 2012 and in Germany around 2015. And this creates not only severe pressures on growth, and even the OECD projects that the average growth rate for Germany and France from 2010 to 2020 will be between 1.5% and 2% a year. I think that's optimistic, actually. But of course, it also then creates enormous political pressures because older people receive the majority of the social supports in all advanced societies. And in particular, it's not only its pensions and its health care, and in health care in particular, we have a convergence of the fact that the most common and expensive conditions, which are heart disease and cancers, are highly concentrated in people age 60 and above. Again, this is much less of a problem when the generation succeeding it is larger than that generation, but we have that reversal now. And it's going to cause some enormous political stresses, particularly in Europe and in the United States as well over the next 10 years. The second force, the second large shift that we see is happening in geopolitics. For more than 1,000 years, geopolitics has been defined by various forms of balances of power. Often you would have one nation that was more powerful than other nations, but in every other instance before the current period, there were near peers who could constrain the discretion of the largest power. This is an anomalous time in geopolitical history. Most of our the lives of everybody here was defined by the great balance of power between the Soviet Union and the United States. We had this singular phenomenon of the collapse from within, in the absence of a war, of one of the great superpowers, leaving only one. After a time in which all the countries which had been the great powers of the world for the preceding 200 years had outsourced their security to the United States. And when that occurred, the United States, our country, the sole superpower, intensified its investment in national security assets, while the rest of the world continued to decrease it, so that today the United States not only spends more on defense than the rest of the world combined, and more on R&D, defense R&D, than any single nation spends on other nation on any other defense, is the guarantor of the sea lanes and the air lanes through which all oil and trade occurs. And there are the first implication of this new configuration in geopolitics is that the entire world becomes the interest of the sole superpower, in part because there's no external power to constrain it. And we see this not only in the Bush administration, we saw it in the Clinton administration, where the Clinton administration acted into local and regional conflicts and situations in virtually every continent in the world, and acted indeed as a sole superpower. There are a lot of implications of this, but one that's most relevant, I suppose, is that even though we have learned that a sole superpower is not necessarily competent, not necessarily wise in the way they exercise that power, a sole superpower has no alternative but to exercise its power and influence. And indeed, the rest of the world depends on it, because there is no other nation which can project forces around the world when regional conflicts threaten the interests of the rest of the world, most notably in the Middle East, but not only in the Middle East, in Pakistan and the potential conflict between Pakistan and India, in the heart of Europe, which we saw in Bosnia and Kosovo. So that this role, at least for the next 10 to 15 years, of the United States as either a competent or not competent guarantor of global stability has been built into the global system and to all of our futures. And the third force is economic globalization. Now, as an economist, this is the one which I naturally kind of recur to, I suppose. But it is really quite remarkable. First, there is the dimension. In 1990, 18% of all the goods and services produced in the world were traded across borders. Last year, it was 30%. We have never seen an increase of those dimensions before. Moreover, this is not the old international trade of the last several hundred years writ larger, but a quite different phenomenon. And it's driven largely by technological change. First, by the ability to radically deconstruct the manufacturing process so that whatever you're making can now be broken down into 40 or 50 different processes, and each of those distributed in the place where it can be done most efficiently and effectively, and then knit together through advances in information technologies to create global networks. And so that the traditional pattern of trade in which advanced economies would buy commodities from developing economies and then bring those commodities back, produce them into something at home which they would then mainly sell to other advanced economies, which was the basic pattern of international trade for several hundred years, is entirely different now. The production is distributed across the world, and with the growth of developing markets is now sold around the world. So that the significance of this globalization is entirely different. And in this new system, we're seeing the emergence of really two poles of globalization. And the two poles are really the United States and China. China has become, because both of the size of its potential market and its supply of cheap labor and cheap real estate and tax incentives, is becoming the production and assembly platform for basic commodities for the entire world. And it will spread beyond China over the next 10 to 15 years to other countries like Bangladesh and Indonesia and perhaps India. And this really arose from China's decision to pursue an entirely different model of modernization than any other country has ever pursued before. In the past, every country, the United States, the European societies, India, modernized basically through the model of what economists call import substitution. You build protectionist walls to allow your own industries to develop protected from foreign competition until they're strong enough so they can go out into the world and compete with more advanced economies. China tried an entirely different model, and a model which could only occur in an era of globalization, could only occur in an era in which sophisticated manufacturing processes and advanced business organizations could be transferred anywhere in the world. Instead of building walls, she tore them down and invited the world's advanced nations and their most advanced corporations to move entire business organizations to China. And the result is that China has become created an export tsunami. Her exports grew from $65 billion in 1995 to $800 billion last year. One of the results of that is that it's overwhelming the exports of many other developing nations and driving, in an interesting way, accelerated modernization in other developing countries. As other countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Uruguay and Egypt, try to get out of the way of Chinese competition. And the way they get out of that competition in particular is they try to move up the value chain a little. And in so doing, they advance the modernization of their own economies. But in the process, they then put more competitive pressure on economies that had been one step above the value chain from them before. Industry by industry, this is occurring. And the result has been a singular intensification in competition around the world. And the way we can recognize that is that corporations have seen their pricing leverage reduced. Their ability to raise their prices has been reduced. That's the primary reason why global inflation has been historically low for the last 10 years. Well, this is now posing a new and unexpected problem for the United States and for the world's advanced economies. Because as this globalization process intensifies competition and reduces pricing leverage, more and more US corporations in particular have had to confront certain fast rising fixed costs, in particular healthcare and energy. The employer provided healthcare costs have gone up 100% in the last 7 years. On the employee side, it's up 87%. Energy costs likewise have more than doubled in that period. Now, what do corporations do? What do businesses do when certain fixed costs rise very fast and intense competition makes it very difficult to pass on those additional costs in higher prices? They cut other costs. And the costs they have been cutting are wages and jobs. And so we are seeing now in the US economy an historic decoupling of the traditional relationships between how fast an economy grows and how many jobs it creates, and how much productivity increases and how much wages rise. The Bush administration says it's very proud of having created between 5 and 6 million jobs in the last 6 years. In the 8 years of the Clinton administration, we created 22 million jobs. Following the 1990 and 1980 recessions, it took 18 months to return to pre-recession job levels. This time it took 52 months. In the 1990s, productivity rose an average annual rate of about 2.5% a year, and the median wage rose 2.2% a year. This is the way free labor markets work. As workers become more productive, their wages get bid up. Nothing has happened to change the freedom of US labor markets. But productivity in the last 5 years has risen at an average annual rate of 3% a year, the best record since the 1960s. And the median wage, which covers 75% of the workforce, that is everyone who's not a manager or a professional, has stagnated. This is creating a new set of structural problems for the US economy, even as the United States has become really the advanced economy that thrives most in globalization. We are the most globalized advanced economy in the world. 44% of our exports go to developing nations. 50% of our imports come from developing nations, and 27% of our foreign direct investment is in developing nations. The three major economies of Europe, Germany, France, and Britain, 20% of their imports come from developing nations, as opposed to 50% for us. About 16% of their exports go to developing nations, again, as opposed to 44% for us. And 9% of their foreign direct investment is in the developing world. The European economies trade and invest almost exclusively with themselves and with the United States. The United States has globalized with the globalization of the overall economy, which is why our growth rate and our productivity rate has far outpaced any other advanced economy. For the overall economy, this has been a very positive development. Moreover, the United States, globalization changes the role of advanced economies in the global economy, with China and other developing nations becoming the production and assembly platform. The role of advanced nations is to develop the new ideas, the new products and processes and materials, new ways of financing and marketing and distributing goods, new ways of organizing a workplace and running a business. This again is a strength of the American economy because in particular, America, the U.S. economy is leading other large economies, not some of the smaller advanced economies, but other large economies, in really becoming an idea-based economy. You know, the idea-based economy has been a metaphor for a long time. It's not a metaphor. It's now a concrete reality. We can see in Federal Reserve data for the first time in economic history that corporations in the United States since 1995 invested more in intangible goods than they did in physical assets. That's in patents and copyrights and databases and brands and way of organizing and training their workers. In 1984, the book value of the 150 largest American corporations, that's what you could sell their physical assets for on the open market, was equal to 75% of their market value. Large U.S. corporations were worth a little more than what their physical assets were worth. In 2005, the book value of the 150 largest U.S. corporations was equal to 36% of their market value. 2/3 of the value of large U.S. corporations now lies in their intangible assets. That is the concrete reality of an idea-based economy. The challenge for the next president, the challenge for progressives, is to fashion a series of policies and responses that first of all can reconnect the traditional relationship between how fast the economy grows and how many jobs it creates, and the traditional link between how much productivity rises and how much wages rise, or else we will consign 3/4 of the American workforce at least to no prospect of upward mobility and produce a kind of politics much closer to a European model, I suspect, than the American model. And the other is and this is part of that process, is to ensure that every American worker can operate effectively in an idea-based economy. In 10 years, there will be no jobs in the United States that do not require an ability to function effectively in a work environment suffused with information technologies, whether it's a construction worker who will hold a handheld computer that will direct him or her on what rivets to next drive in and the job after that, or a truck driver who will always be operating off of fairly sophisticated on-cab computers. 50% of American workers today can't operate a computer, can't operate on the internet. So we have a series of new challenges that are both demographic, and even though the demographic problem in the United States is less than in Europe, almost exclusively because of immigration, we still face the same healthcare financing crisis that the Europeans and Japanese will face. We face an enormous challenge in managing the assets of a sole superpower in a wise way and a competent way, and rebuilding global coalitions to advance the interests that the sole superpower frankly defines, which was the model of the Clinton administration. And perhaps most difficult of all, adjust to these new and historic changes in economic dynamics brought about by an historic process of globalization that will define our economic lives and the lives of our children for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. What I'd like to do, Tracy, we have a mic, right? So just please raise your hand, identify yourself when you get the mic, and I'd like to make sure the first 3 or 4 questions are directed to Rob, and then we'll throw it open for a broader subject matter about politics or anything else. I should say directed to Rob about his book and his argument.
Hi, nice to see you again. The big question I have, you made a distinction of our trade towards developing nations, both import and export, and I want to understand what relevance does it have, whether it's with a developed nation or not, or an undeveloped nation. It makes, to me, it makes no difference. So maybe you can explain the difference.
The process of globalization, and in particular the technological changes, create the possibility to locate parts of production and not in developing nations which can produce them more efficiently, i.e. more cheaply, than advanced nations. Moreover, the developing world is the source of major growth in the world today. Most of the growth has come from the developing world. So these are the markets that are expanding quickly. So they offer not only greater efficiencies in production for corporations, but also much larger markets and fast-growing markets. And so that if you limit yourself to high-cost production areas and slow-growing markets, your economy in the end will perform significantly less well than if you recognize the opportunities and realities of globalization.
Doesn't explain it well enough.
I don't know what part I'm not being clear enough about.
What I mean is, just
look. The cost of producing a piece of an automobile is cheaper in China than it is in Spain, because the labor is cheaper, the real estate is cheaper, the parts are cheaper, and moreover, the market for automobiles is growing faster, not only in China but across Asia, than it is in Europe. So on both sides of that equation, it makes economic sense.
Let me just, if you can illustrate, if I'm buying a General Electric refrigerator with parts made in 6 different countries, how does that fit into the equation versus whether or not an English person or a French person buys that General Electric refrigerator? In other words, when you're doing the math, whether the General Electric refrigerator is getting sold by an American company.
Correct.
So what difference does it make in this computation if an Englishman or a Frenchman buys the refrigerator in his home?
Well, it in fact doesn't make any difference at all. It's just that the demand for refrigerators is growing a lot faster in the developing world than it is in France or in general, in order to really operate effectively in markets like, in any large market, you have to not only, you have to have a permanent presence in that market. This is, you know, this is why even in the face of globalization, there will always be auto plants in the United States because you need to be part of the market. Well, the United States is a large and reasonably fast-growing market, not growing nearly as fast as some other countries, but the fastest-growing markets in the world are now almost exclusively in the developing world.
And if I can just add that, you know, as a student of Rob's, is that this is one of the, I think, most important parts of the book, because I think there's a lot of economic pessimism in the United States right now, for very good reason. And he talked about why that is, about how the struggle of everyday people has gotten tougher. But the truth is that the American corporations are in much better shape, and in many ways there are large parts of the American economy that are in much better shape than any comparable industrial nation in the world, and that there is great assets here. I mean, we have liabilities in our balance sheet, our economic balance sheet. There are liabilities, but we have tremendous assets. And I think part of what's so interesting about this book is that I think it's a very accurate portrayal of where we are, and that's going to be a prerequisite for making sound policy, you know, particularly after the Bush administration. Let me ask, yes, hey, Peter, how are you?
How do you deal with, in this country, the problems that you identified of slower job growth and slower wage growth that result from globalization? Is it simply a matter of better training and education?
No.
There's something politically that's needed too in getting from here to there, because as we see in these primaries that are being fought out right now, globalization and free trade are dirty words.
Right. No, it's not simply training at all. Though training is particularly important for the distribution of the benefits of globalization or of a growing economy. And in particular because we have a government and a system that pays almost no attention to it, that focuses all of its concern about human capital on the education system. And in effect says once you're out of the education system, there is no social responsibility anymore. We've had an enormous failure, I think, in public policy towards training, providing opportunities for additional training for the existing workforce. And we can't wait 40 years for the current generation of students who are all IT savvy, those savvy in technologies that will be obsolete in 10 years too, to dominate the workforce. But no, what this analysis tells us is in particular that fast rising healthcare costs and fast rising energy costs, the absence of a serious national policy in either healthcare or in energy has now become a fundamental jobs and wage issue. The only way that globalization is not going away, the intensification of competition is not going away. The only way to reconnect that I can see overall growth and job creation, the traditional links and productivity and gains and wage increases, is to try to weaken or remove the barriers that are breaking that link. And those are, since we can't make competition less intense, and it's not clear we would want to, even if we could, but it's not within our power anyway, comes from the nature of the global system. We have to instead slow the rate of increase in healthcare costs and make the economy much more energy efficient so it is that much less sensitive to increases in energy costs in order to try to reconnect those phenomena.
And
you're saying that the slow job growth and the slow wage growth is more caused by increased energy costs and health costs than it is by global competition?
No, it's caused by the collision of fast rising healthcare costs and fast rising energy costs with the intensification of competition, which makes it harder for businesses to pass on those increases in higher prices. So it's unfortunately not a simple phenomenon. It's in fact quite complex, and which makes it much harder as a matter of public policy. The bottom line, however, is that healthcare policy is no longer simply a social policy issue, though it certainly is that. It's now a basic wage and jobs issue. And energy policy is no longer simply a security issue, but a basic wage and jobs policy as well.
Well, and we add in our work on our website, we add in addition to that first pillar, 2 additional pillars, which are an agenda to invest in people, not just kids. I mean, we have to obviously improve our public schools, and I mean, there's been a lot of work done on this for a long time, but also some kind of regime that's really going to deal with basic skills of that large part of the workforce that really cannot operate in an ideas-based economy. One of the ideas that we came up with, for example, was to, for $125 million a year, you can keep every computer lab and every community college open 2 nights a week for free computer training for any American who wants it. And I'm happy to say that that idea is about to be introduced in the House by John Larson, Vice Chair of the Democratic Caucus, and Barack Obama has actually endorsed it in his presidential race. The third pillar is also an agenda to invest in innovation, and because part of the analysis of Rob's is that it's harder to actually create jobs in this. I mean, that there's a lag, there's a downward pressure on job creation, and looking at things like investing in infrastructure and other ways that will help us accelerate innovation throughout the entire economy, investment in the NIH, investment in the, the traditional ways that ideas are created in the economy, which is sort of the third piece. So it's, the 3 pieces are creating a national energy and healthcare strategy that's going to reduce costs over time, which clearly we don't have today. Second is to invest in people in a much more strategic manner and put higher premium on human capital, the skills argument, Peter. Third is to invest in a much more strategic way to accelerate innovation throughout the economy. And so one of the ideas that we've been toying with and that Rob's going to be coming out with later in the year is to do a tax shift, for example, to replace half of the payroll tax with a carbon tax. And so it would be one way of dealing with the most regressive tax that is definitely a depressor on new job creation with a tax that would be more virtuous for the economy, replacing a bad tax with a good tax, for example. And I think these are the creative ways we're going to have to think about in the future how we're going to handle globalization and what's happening with wage and jobs, because clearly this is the central governing challenge, domestic governing challenge of our time, and perhaps the central governing challenge of our time, and one that will be driving American politics, I think, is driving American politics today and will continue over the next few years.
At what price of oil would it be cheap, would the cost of transporting goods from, let's say, China make it more expensive than manufacturing stuff here in this country?
Good question.
Well, I don't know, is the simple answer. But it is the case that the run-up in oil prices potentially has the impact of an increase in energy prices is closely related to the energy intensity of your economy, which is to say how much energy it takes to produce $1 or €1 or a renminbi of GDP. The current run-up, Europe and Japan are much more energy efficient than the United States. And that is, it takes much less energy to produce $1 or €1 of GDP in Europe than its equivalent in the United States. And they're less impacted by this increase economically. China, on the other hand, is of the large economies, unsurprisingly, the least energy efficient. And her demand for energy is rising much faster than anyone else's. And so the potential economic impact on China is actually much larger than on the United States, which has, China China finds itself in a unique situation in many respects, and one of them is the relationship between its politics and its economy. It's a state in which the legitimacy of the political system has come to be based on its ability to produce strong economic growth. It's not a totalitarian system, which it was maybe 30 years ago, but is an absolute authoritarian system. That is, political power is highly concentrated. There are no civil institutions, no elections, no press, etc. And the trade-off has been, we maintain political power, even in the face of the collapse of the legitimacy of the ideology on which the regime was based, not only by the Cultural Revolution, but also by the collapse of global socialism, so long as we can deliver strong economic growth. And China has not, since that period, in this modern period, has not experienced a significant slowdown. And so there's a lot of concern in Chinese circles about the long-term impact of a sustained oil prices in the current range on economic growth in China.
Yep. Tracy, who's got the mic?
It's on?
Yeah.
You hear me? Oh, okay. I have a question. It seems like you say we're in a new competitive system, and we're now become an idea economy. But what we want to do is go back to our traditional economic model, or I don't get it.
No. Look, the model, you can't choose the model anymore. The system chooses the model for you, frankly. What we have to do is recognize the way in which the change in these conditions is affecting the way the economy operates and try to take account of it. And in particular, that the United States had an economy in which the prospects for most workers in the economy were correlated fairly reasonably well with the performance of the overall economy. And that's broken down in a very measurable and significant degree. Well, we need to figure out why that's happening, and then fashion a response in order to restore not the old economy. The old economy, not only is it gone, but the United States has led the way in I don't want to say burying it, but moving past it. But rather to restore the benefits that we saw in the old economy and the relationship between the overall economy and average people's prospects in it.
But if you're saying that restore the domestic benefits,
yes.
as opposed to looking at a world where there's other, how do we adjust to that? Other people's benefits.
Well, in fact, globalization, a process which is really, which probably the United States advanced more than any other nation because we're the architects of the WTO, which set the terms for the opening of developing economies to both domestic competition and foreign direct investment. The greatest benefits of globalization, thus far at least, have been felt in some of the poorest countries in the world, most notably China and India, where the transfer of modern business organizations has driven not only very fast growth, but very fast income gains. And that's true throughout most of the developing world. Globalization has been in purely economic terms, a clear benefit to every developing nation which has accommodated itself to its terms. China is the leading example. And those nations which have not, which have resisted it, resisted foreign direct investment in particular, and also failed to make the kinds of public investments necessary in order for their people to operate effectively in that context, which is mainly education, basic infrastructure, basic health and sanitation. Those economies have fallen behind.
Can I just add one thing to that, because it gets to the political context that of the presidential election, is that, you know, the Clinton administration was the architect of this whole global economic system that we're describing right now. And it is interesting that when you go back through American history since FDR, that it's really been the progressives and the liberals who've been the ones who have been the great proponents for the most part, on this open trading system that we have today. And that as we look to take stock of what happened with Clintonism and to help inform the economic debate, is that it is true that for the people in this room who consider themselves to be left of center, is that the economic strategy of the Clinton administration has probably done more to alleviate poverty, despair, ignorance, isolation around the world than any other set of policies in modern times, right? And that we have been the great liberators of literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of people around the world who are, want not the American dream, but the global dream, whatever it's called. And that's something that we actually did. Susan's here. I mean, there are many of us who worked on this stuff in the 90s. And I look back on this with tremendous pride and saying that we've brought tremendous opportunity to more people than probably any other time in history and alleviated more poverty than any other time in history. And that was through capitalism, right? That wasn't through foreign aid. The challenge now domestically is to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Is to recognize that the way globalization is playing out here in the United States is having unintended consequences, or perhaps foreseeable consequences that not all of us actually completely understood. But we have met more difficult challenges than this before in our history. And I think that the key now is to not believe that globalization is the problem, but it's the lack of an adequate government response and a societal response to tackle, to offer the people who are coming up the same opportunities as we had before. I was at the World Economic Forum in Cancun in Latin America a couple of weeks ago, and it was striking being there about how just happy and optimistic all these countries were about what was happening in the world, right? There's 5% GDP growth throughout Latin America. There's some obvious, countries that are not participating. Venezuela, Bolivia are not part of this great wave of opportunity that's breaking out through Latin America. But today, because of the economic strategy in the United States, that Latin America is seeing a more prosperous time than they've ever had in their history, right? So when I was there was a sense of optimism and excitement about globalization, about the world that was unfolding, at a direct contrast to any meeting we have here, right? When we consider these same issues. And so what is remarkable is that as the rest of the world embraces, in essence, the American model, they are seeing, to the countries that can manage it effectively and deal with modernity and put the pieces in place, they're seeing unbelievable societal benefits. But creating and sort of managing this wave of modernization and globalization really is something affecting every civil society throughout the world, and something that as a thing we have to get better at both domestically and I think in our foreign policy and helping other societies manage it as well.
Look, we have, as compared to the other advanced nations in the world, our domestic economy and our major corporations have adjusted much more effectively to technological change and to globalization. So as an overall economy, we have much more resources to use to address these other issues. And frankly, none of them is that tough. The notion that it would be tough to create we know that it's not tough or not an insoluble problem to create a much more energy efficient economy, because indeed, a lot of other economies have done it. And now, in fact, we have an additional incentive, a huge incentive, which is climate change. And giving us really the opportunity to harness America's strength in technological innovation, which is the result of generations of investment in higher education, and a preference for entrepreneurism, for the creation of new companies, and a sophisticated financial system that finances new ventures. These are all things that are already given. We already have them. And we can channel this by changing some market signals into the development of new technologies that are much more energy efficient and alternative fuels. This is as, you know, on the scale of problems, this is one that that is really not that difficult to figure out how to do. Apparently, it is difficult to actually do, but that's a political issue, which is why the case needs to be made. Healthcare is tougher because globalization is driving part of this healthcare crisis. The healthcare financing is really the collision of globalization and demographics. The demographics are given. Well, globalization increases the demand for medical technologies. As it does, it increases research and development into these technologies, and that increases the pace of the development of those technologies. We've been particularly good at that in the United States. It happens those technologies are very expensive. Biologics, for example, biologic pharmaceuticals are moving to the center of the pharmaceutical industry. There are about, I think, 70 to 80 what are called small molecule pharmaceuticals, which are traditional pills in second and third stage clinical trials. There are 300 biologics. Biologics, on average, are 45 times more expensive than small molecule pills. This is where pharmaceuticals are moving because that's where the science moved. That's where genomics moved. Well, this is a harder problem, frankly, than energy because there's no substitute for, you can substitute one fuel for another. It's a lot harder to substitute one medical treatment for another. I frankly think we will eventually, I'm not welcoming this, but eventually I think we'll move to, we will stop being an outlier in one singular respect with in our healthcare system. We are the only advanced nation that doesn't control healthcare prices, which is why we spend 16% of GDP on healthcare, and France, which has a very similar healthcare system in almost every other respect, spends about 11% of GDP. England and Japan, with very strict healthcare price controls, spend about 9% and have a lot of quality issues. I'm not welcoming that, but it seems to me a likely place we're going to end up. But again, these are issues which we don't lack the intellectual capacity to figure out how to address them, even if it's an entirely different way than I've laid out here. We have lacked the sense of national urgency to do so. Well, if in fact globalization has created a set of conditions under which the absence of the will to address these issues means that we're going to consign 3/4 of Americans to long-term income stagnation, that is a matter of political urgency.
One or two more. Yes, sir.
So, thank you very much for writing the book and joining us. And I'm glad to see that you still have excitement to talk about the subject despite having gone through the pains of writing a book. I wonder if you could speak about generational aspects of productivity. So last week we spoke about the millennial generation. Is there evidence that we might see a large leap in productivity gains across all industries as those people born after 1980 become a larger percentage of the workforce? So the truck driver to the office worker using, a social aspect of technology or artificial intelligence or something. Are there generational aspects to productivity that could lead to positive gains, and what's the implications for then older generations that might see those same gains?
Well, I think that I think it's a plausible hypothesis anyway. I also think that, you know, as a general proposition, the more schooling you have, the more education you have, the more adaptable you are to change in a work environment. This has also been one of the U.S. advantages. You know, we think of our education system as really substandard, and by some tests, particularly against mainly small economies, that's true. But if you look at the average years of schooling of the American workforce versus the Japanese, British, German, French labor forces, we average about 12 years. France is 9. And England and Germany are about 10. Now that's closing. That's largely a phenomenon of higher education. And the numbers of Europeans and Japanese who graduate high school, who go on to college and universities, has been rising very rapidly. But as a general phenomenon, the years of education are increasing everywhere, and that will make people more adaptable. One last comment. I was at a conference in Germany last week on China, and there were a number of people from China there, and from other countries around the world. And one of the things that struck me was the description of the demand for change and being transmitted mainly through the internet across China among young people. And I thought of that, and I thought of the phenomenon of what's happening in our presidential elections, and the sharp increase in involvement by young people in our political process, largely through the Obama campaign, but also through the Clinton campaign. And I began to wonder, you know, the millennial generation is huge, as the baby boomers were huge. Whether maybe we were entering another 1968 kind of period. That is when you saw movements in many countries for social change being driven by a large cohort of young people who now can communicate in a way with each other through the internet that was not possible. Well, purely speculative.
Well, but 2 points on this, because the forum we did last week was with Morley and here in the Harvard Club. 2 just quick observations, because one is, look, I mean, the great divide in the Democratic primary right now is not white and black and white or Hispanic, or even, you know, to some degree male and female. It's age, right? I mean, where Hillary is winning older voters and Obama's winning younger voters. And there is no question that the economic grievance that Senator Clinton is expressing in her concern about the economy is really being sort of pitched to much older people who have much greater fear about the ability to adapt to the rapidity of change and the way the economy is unfolding, or all of modernity itself, right, which includes new technologies and new demography in the United States, where we have many more minorities than we used to in the country, and so on. So I do think, Rob, that you're seeing this actually play out in this election, in this primary right now. And second of all, there's a book, former National Security Advisor Brzezinski for Jimmy Carter, who's not universally loved in all circles, has written, I think, a very compelling new book called Second Chance. And one of the things he talks about in this book is this very thing, which is that there is sort of a global awakening happening of people who want greater freedom and greater prosperity, that as they are moving up the economic food chain and being given more economic opportunity, and since economic opportunity now is so interwoven with access to information and access to this global communications network, you know, there are 6 billion people in the world, 3 billion people now have a cell phone and are connected together through the global communications network, that when you have a cell phone, as we are about to find out in Cuba, right, you know, you can see images from around the world, and you're connected, and you can start to understand more about what's happening. And I do think, you know, we're doing a lot of work in NDN at a policy level about the incredible liberating aspects of this global communications revolution that's happening, and how it's connected to increase democratization at a time where there is huge numbers of young people. So we, in fact, are about to launch a whole project on this. That's that Tom Khalil, I believe, believe it or not, I know, coming back from the old days, an old timer, is going to be working with us on. But I just wrote a long essay about this on our website called "The Power of Mobile," which is this whole thing about how we're seeing this explosion. Or take another example, Egypt, right? Egypt had 6 weeks ago the largest civic demonstrations and rallies that have been seen in the modern era in Egypt. It was largely organized through cell phones, not over just food prices, but just general unhappiness with an authoritarian state. And I think that, Rob, you're correct. I think we are in a period where you're going to see, with these new tools of citizen involvement, greater understanding, higher levels of education, greater access to information technology, we could see a global revolution of democratization the way, frankly, we're seeing here in the domestic US and the internet. Let me take one last question before we all go. Anybody else got anything else? Yes, sir. Do you want to? Wait, Mike. Because every moment is now YouTubeable for the rest of your life, so make sure you get it right.
So who of the three major candidates do you think has the best shot at solving these two intractable problems?
Well, I know the candidate that has no shot. John McCain thinks that the only thing that's wrong with the U.S. economy is that corporations pay too much taxes. He misses everything that is significant about our current economic condition, everything. So I'm certain that John McCain doesn't. Look, I think that between Senator Obama and Senator Clinton, they are both committed to dealing with all of the major issues that we've laid out. Whether or not they understand yet that in dealing with those issues, they're dealing with a fundamental new economic dynamic, they're both very capable of understanding it and will understand it. And I have spoken to Senator Clinton about it, in general terms anyway, and she gets it. And Senator Obama has received some material about it. I haven't spoken to him about it, but I know he'll get it. So I don't, and look, this is the whole point of the policy aspect of this, is to advance the fundamental values of progressive politics in America. You could make the judgment that you don't care whether 75% of the country have any prospects for upward mobility or not. That's a different political judgment. That's not ours. It's not that of anybody in this room. So I feel pretty confident that that either Senator Obama or Senator Clinton could carry this out. The challenge, the political challenge, and Simon can talk about this probably better than I can, is that the economic insecurity of these conditions, layered on top of the current recession, is creating intensifying doubts about what is generally called trade, but is really the new global economic system. We got to learn to make the best of it, and I think we can. The great thing is there is a real opportunity. The biggest challenge is, again, as in energy policy, is a political challenge. It's a challenge of political will, not a challenge of understanding or even figuring out a credible way to address it.
I'll just close with a couple thoughts, which is, and Rob just teed up a lot of stuff in that last comment, and I thought he did a great job, by the way, at walking the fine line between the Clinton and Obama thing. Don't you think he did a very good job? NDN is officially neutral, by the way, in that difficult contest. A couple of closing thoughts. We have been raising the alarm bell about this issue for 3 years, Rob and I. where we have been arguing that the economic data about what was happening in the middle class was going to inevitably start to alter American politics. And when we wrote our first essay on this back in May, it was 3 years ago, Rob, it was May of 2005, it was, you know, I still think not well understood. A lot of the economics you're hearing tonight and about what was happening with the struggle of the middle class was not very well understood. It is clearly understood today, right? I mean, I think we clearly understand as a nation that and whatever's going on, Tracy, or whatever, can we hold it down a little bit? That that this issue of how hard it is for people to get ahead in this new global economy is now front and center in the presidential race. We believe it is what drove the Republicans out of power in 2006. If you read a study we did about the exit polls of the 2006 elections, I think it is clear and unequivocal that the Republicans' economic performance was a much bigger factor in their defeat than the war was, or corruption. And I think that this has been the sleeping giant of American politics in the last few years that is now woken, because it is unsustainable as a country if 75% of the Americans are not participating in the prosperity of an age. And as progressives, this should be the central obsession of our politics. Rob said an interesting thing. He said, could you imagine if Bill Clinton was president and we had year after year of high GDP growth and people were making less money? Bill Clinton would be shaking the rafters and grabbing Bob Rubin and Rob Shapiro and everybody else saying, God damn it, go figure this out. What are we going to do? And it's not clear that George Bush even knows it's happening, right? At this point, right? And certainly Paulson, who gave a speech about this, and I really think Paulson's a very smart guy, the major speech he gave about this, he did at 8 o'clock at night up at Columbia, and they didn't tell the media, they didn't alert the media he was speaking there, right? So they kind of buried it from an administration standpoint. So I want to say that, but this is a big issue, because I get asked about this all the time, is why have you Democrats become so protectionist, and what's changed in your economic strategy? What's changed is that the American people have changed. It's not the Democratic Party. It's that the Pew just did a poll of 60 countries around the world, from very small African countries to the United States, about their attitudes towards globalization and trade. And Americans had the lowest, and they asked, do you believe in globalization? Of the 60 countries polled, fewer Americans believe in globalization than any other country. And in the African countries, globalization had a 90% approval rating, right? Here was about 50%, right? And so what's happening is people are, in a very pragmatic way, losing faith that the economy is actually working for them, because it actually isn't, right? So the issue isn't ideology, it isn't rhetoric, it isn't about, those damn Democrats are throwing protectionist walls. The Democrats who have inherited after 2006, George Bush has done more to undermine global liberalization and economically liberal policies than any president in modern times, because of his lack of response to the new economic circumstances and his repeated betrayal of Clinton's legacy through Doha in 2002 and the collapse of the Doha round and the Farm Bill in 2002, and I can go down a whole litany of stuff. Of all the things we have to add to what this guy blew when he was in office, right, and what he left behind, the entire global economic trading system has been weakened under Bush, right? So we've got enormous challenges ahead. We believe strongly that the path is forward and not backward, that we have to embrace the reality of the economic age that we're in and have a much better strategy to make sure that globalization works for all Americans. I am not pessimistic about this, because I think we've met much greater challenges in our past, and I think we can meet these challenges, but we have to start with actually coming to a better understanding of what is actually happening. And to that, I give Rob Shapiro an awful lot of credit. I mean, the reason why Rob and I started working together 3 years ago is that I did a huge survey of all the economic literature in the left of center politics, and to be honest, I felt that Rob was the only guy who was making sense to me. And I'm very proud of the work we've done. I think we've had an enormous impact, but we have, I think, our biggest and most important tests are in front of us. And so what I want to close with is saying that I want to thank Bernard Schwartz, who was here earlier, but I don't think he's still with us, who's been the great inspiration for a lot of the work that we've done and has funded and allowed us to do a lot of new and innovative work in our globalization arena, and I know he was here earlier. This is part of a series of forums we're doing around the country. I want to thank Tracy Lehman, who's here, who runs all of our events nationally, who's here putting this on. Michael Moynihan is here somewhere as well, or was here, who's the head of our new and exciting green project, who's part of our team and is really going to be putting NDN much more in the front and center in this whole conversation about how do we deal with climate change in the coming months. And Rob, thanks to you. I really appreciate it. And I want to say, if you want to stay in touch with this, not only should you buy the book before you leave, but
I'll sign it.
Yeah, is that you know, we do write about all this daily on our blog at ndnblog.org and on the NDN website at ndn.org. So stay in touch. And if you haven't signed up, we will be doing a series of events this summer and fall. So make sure we have your email so you can stay in touch with us. But thanks everybody very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.